So, you think you know the story of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Well, what if I told you the big ideas, the ones that really matter, didn't actually come from its famous founders? Today, we're going to dig into the hidden spiritual DNA of AA. It's a forgotten history that honestly made the whole thing possible.
Okay, so let's start with the story everyone knows. It's almost like a modern myth, you know? It all kicks off with two guys completely at the end of their ropes who find this incredible hope just by connecting with each other.
Right, so picture this. Akron, Ohio, 1935. You've got Bill Wilson, a stockbroker from New York who's struggling, and he meets this local surgeon, Dr. Bob Smith. I mean, everyone had written them off as hopeless alcoholics. But when they started talking, really talking, they discovered something amazing. That one alcoholic sharing with another had this unique power. And right there, in that moment, that's the birth of AA as we know.
But here's the thing, and this is our big question today. Where did those world-changing ideas actually come from? I mean, yeah, that meeting was the spark, for sure. But the fuel for that fire, the really deep stuff, looking at yourself, making things right, helping other people, that didn't just pop into existence. The real origin story? Well, that starts with a totally different guy, years earlier and a whole ocean away.
And this is where it gets interesting. The story doesn't actually start with an alcoholic. Nope. It starts with a Lutheran minister who was just eaten up by a bitter resentment. And his name was Frank Buchman.
So back in 1908, Buchman's running this hospice for boys in need. But he gets into this big fight with the board of trustees because they wanted to cut the food budget. Can you believe it? He got so angry he just quit. He ends up sailing off to Europe, totally miserable, just stewing in this anger. And that's a feeling that anyone who's ever found their way to AA would recognize in a heartbeat.
So there he is, sitting in some small church, and bam, it hits him. A huge realization. He sees that the real problem wasn't the trustees, it was his own pride, his own anger. So what does he do? He immediately sits down and writes apology letters to every single one of them. And that simple process, that moment of clarity, making it right, and then feeling that freedom, that became the absolute blueprint for everything that followed.
Now, Buchman didn't just keep this amazing experience to himself. Oh no, he started building a whole fellowship around these ideas. It was this kind of informal movement that would eventually make its way all the way across the Atlantic and land right in the laps of the people who desperately needed to hear it.
And this fellowship, it came to be known as the Oxford Group. Their goal was, well, it was huge. They wanted to change the entire world. But their method, it was super personal. It was all about changing one life at a time through these really practical spiritual principles. Just helping people find a totally new way to live.
And this is where the journey of the idea itself is just incredible. It's like a game of telephone, but for spiritual truth. It all starts with the famous psychiatrist, Dr. Carl Jung. He tells his patient, a guy named Roland H., look, your only real hope for your alcoholism is a vital spiritual experience. So where does Roland find that? You guessed it, the Oxford Group. Then Roland passes what he's learned on to his friend, Ebby T. And it's Ebby who shows up one day and shares that exact message of hope with Bill W. right there at his kitchen table in 1934. I mean, think about that. A direct, unbroken line all the way from Zurich to Brooklyn. Wow.
So you might be wondering how this all connects. Well, in the very beginning, there was no Alcoholics Anonymous. The first alcoholics to get sober, guys like Bill W. and Dr. Bob, weren't just borrowing some ideas from the Oxford Group. For years, they were in the Oxford Group. They were actual members.
And when you look at the practices side by side, the connection is it's undeniable. The Oxford Group's whole deal was self-examination, admitting where you went wrong, making things right, and then going out to help other people. Does that sound familiar? It's the absolute bedrock of what would later become the 12 steps. We're not just talking about inspiration here. This was like a direct transfer of spiritual technology.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Bill W. himself couldn't have been clearer. He said, and I'm quoting here, that the early AA got its ideas straight from the Oxford Groups and from nowhere else. So this isn't some historian's pet theory. This is a foundational fact, straight from the mouth of the guy who co-founded the whole thing. Okay, so if the connection was so strong, you've got to be asking, why did they split? Well, as more and more alcoholics started getting sober within the group, it became pretty clear that even though the spiritual principles were a perfect fit, the container they came in just wasn't. A separation had to happen.
And it didn't happen overnight. It was more of a gradual breakaway, starting in New York and then happening in Akron. The early AA members just realized that if they were really going to be effective at reaching other alcoholics, they needed their own thing, their own identity, and a much more focused approach.
And there were some pretty big reasons for that split. For one, the Oxford group style was kind of assertive, a bit too in-your-face for a lot of alcoholics. Then there was anonymity. AA was building itself on that idea, but the Oxford group loved to publicize its big-name members. And maybe the biggest reason of all, AA needed a single purpose, just focusing on alcoholism. The Oxford group had a much broader mission. They were talking about fixing drunken nations. Bill W. was smart enough to know that getting tangled up in public controversies like that could completely sink their little movement before it even got started.
But even though they went their separate ways, the early AA folks never really forgot where they came from. And as the years went by, you can see that their gratitude for that foundation actually got even deeper. This quote from Bill W. it's so powerful. Frank Buchman died in 1961, and just a month later, Bill wrote a letter saying how much he wished he'd reached out to thank him in his final years. It's this really moving admission of a debt that he felt was never really paid back in full.
But maybe the most telling story comes from an early AA member in Akron, a guy named Al L. So Al carried around this little stack of photos, kind of like baseball cards, of all the AA pioneers, Bill W., Dr. Bob, all the key players. But the photo he always kept on top of the pile was of a man most people in AA today wouldn't even recognize. It was Frank Buchman.
And whenever anybody asked him why, his answer was always simple, always the same. He'd just say, because that's where it all began. None of this would have happened without Frank. I mean, what a stunning reminder, right? That the deep roots of this incredible, life-saving movement can be traced all the way back to one man getting over a grudge.
So, the story of AA and the Oxford group, it's just this incredible example of how sometimes the most important parts of a story are the ones we've completely forgotten. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other great movements out there have these kinds of hidden roots, just waiting for someone to dig them up?